November 13, 1942. The waters south of Guadalcanal. An American carrier task force slows and turns away from the fight, not because of enemy pressure, not because of losses, but because of fuel. Destroyers escorting the carriers report remaining endurance measured in hours, not days. Boilers are throttled back, flight operations are curtailed. The decision is already made before the order is spoken. The fleet cannot stay. This moment is not dramatic on the surface. No explosions, no air attack, no visible defeat. But it represents one of the most dangerous weaknesses in American naval power in 1942. The United States can win battles. It cannot yet sustain them. The problem is not courage or technology. It is arithmetic. A modern carrier task force consumes fuel at an extraordinary rate. A single fleet carrier burns tens of thousands of gallons of fuel oil per day at cruising speed. Destroyers burn proportionally more. Increase speed, increase maneuvering, increase flight operations, and consumption spikes immediately. Every mile traveled away from a secure port reduces the time the fleet can remain on station. Eventually, range replaces tactics as the dominant factor. In 1942, American naval operations in the Pacific are constrained by this reality. Fleets surge forward, fight briefly, then withdraw. The rhythm of the war is dictated not by enemy action, but by fuel gauges. This is not how the United States Navy planned to fight. Before the war, American naval doctrine assumed a network of forward bases across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor would anchor the fleet. The Philippines, Wake Island, Midway, and other positions would extend American reach westward. Oilers existed, but they were designed to support predictable movements between ports, not continuous high-speed operations thousands of miles from land. Japan dismantled that system in months. Pearl Harbor was damaged. The Philippines fell. Forward bases were isolated or lost entirely. The Pacific became an ocean without reliable fueling points, and American fleets were suddenly operating at the end of extremely long supply lines. At-sea refueling existed, but it was treated as an emergency measure. The process was slow, dangerous, and rarely practiced under combat conditions. Two ships had to steam side by side, often for hours, connected by hoses carrying highly flammable fuel. In rough seas, the risk of collision or rupture was constant. During refueling, both ships were nearly defenseless. In peacetime, this was acceptable. In war, it was crippling. By mid-1942, the reality is unavoidable. Carrier warfare demands endurance. Aircraft carriers cannot loiter. They must constantly maneuver into the wind to launch and recover aircraft. Destroyers must screen them at speed. Battleships, when present, consume fuel at industrial quantities. Every task force becomes a moving refinery. During the Guadalcanal campaign, this logistical weakness becomes painfully clear. American forces fight a series of sharp, violent engagements, naval battles, airstrikes, amphibious landings, but rarely remain in the area long enough to fully exploit success. Commanders begin to refer to fuel as an operational constraint equal to enemy strength. The distances explain why. From Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal is roughly 3,300 nautical miles round trip. Even operating from closer bases like Espiritu Santo or Noumea, fleets burn a significant portion of their fuel simply getting to the fight. Tankers must follow them forward, escorted by destroyers that also consume fuel. Every gallon delivered costs additional gallons to protect and transport. The system feeds on itself. Japanese planners understand this vulnerability. Their bases are closer, their supply lines shorter. Submarines and aircraft target American tankers whenever possible. The loss of a single oiler can shorten fleet operations by days or force a withdrawal altogether. Inside the United States Navy, senior officers recognize that something fundamental must change. The Pacific War cannot be won by fleets tied to ports. It will be decided by forces that can remain at sea indefinitely, shifting concentration, applying pressure continuously, and exploiting success before the enemy can recover. That capability does not yet exist. The oilers available in 1942 are slow. Many are converted commercial tankers. Their top speeds are often several knots lower than fleet units. They cannot keep up with fast carriers during sustained operations. Their defensive armament is minimal. They are not designed to operate inside contested waters. More importantly, there are not enough of them. Even when oilers are available, refueling doctrine remains conservative. Operations are planned around returning to port whenever possible. At-sea replenishment is something commanders prefer to avoid, not integrate. The result is a strategic ceiling on American power. The Navy can strike, but it cannot stay. It can disrupt, but not dominate. It can react, but not yet impose its will across the Pacific. This is not a failure of leadership. It is a mismatch between old assumptions and new realities. Naval warfare has changed faster than the systems that support it. Some officers begin to think differently. If fleets cannot return to fuel, fuel must come to fleets, not as a stopgap, not as an emergency measure, as a permanent, planned, routine function of naval operations. Refueling at sea must become safe, fast, and continuous. Oilers must be able to operate with carriers, not behind them. Logistics ships must be treated as integral combat assets, not auxiliaries. This idea is not glamorous. It does not win headlines or battles, but it represents a quiet revolution in how naval power is projected. Implementing it will require more than new ships. It will require new doctrine, new training, new procedures, and a willingness to accept risk in order to remove a far greater constraint. Crews will have to refuel in heavy seas, at night, under threat of attack. Commanders will have to trust logistics schedules as much as they trust air patrols. There is resistance. Every oiler built consumes shipyard capacity that could produce a destroyer or a carrier. In a war still being fought at the edge of defeat, allocating resources to support ships feels counterintuitive. But the alternative is worse. Without sustained presence, even the largest fleet cannot control an ocean. By late 1942, the decision is made. The Navy will create a new class of fast fleet oilers ships, designed not merely to carry fuel, but to operate alongside the fleet at speed. They will be faster, better defended, and equipped for rapid underway replenishment. Refueling will no longer be an exception. It will become routine. On paper, the concept is sound. In practice, it is unproven. Shipyards must design and build vessels unlike any the Navy has operated before. Crews must learn techniques that have never been standardized. Commanders must plan operations, assuming that fuel will arrive on schedule in open ocean, far from land. If it works, American fleets will be freed from geography. If it fails, task forces will be stranded, exposed, and vulnerable. As 1942 ends, American carriers still turn back early. Destroyers still watch their fuel gauges as closely as their radar screens. But a transformation has begun quiet, technical, and largely invisible to the public. The outcome will determine not just how the Pacific War is fought, but how naval warfare itself will be conducted for the rest of the century. The solution begins on drafting tables, not at sea. In early 1943, American naval planners and ship designers confront a problem with no historical precedent. Fleets must be supplied continuously while moving at speed, operating hundreds or thousands of miles from port under combat conditions. Existing oilers are inadequate. Converted commercial tankers top out at 12 to 14 knots. Carrier task forces routinely cruise faster than that. When the fleet accelerates, the oilers fall behind. When the fleet maneuvers, the oilers cannot keep station. The new ships must do what no logistics vessel has been required to do before. They must be fast enough to keep up with carriers and destroyers. They must be stable enough to transfer fuel in heavy seas. They must be strong enough to survive operating in contested waters. And they must be numerous enough that losing one does not paralyze an entire operation. Speed is the first requirement. Naval architects settle on a minimum sustained speed of 18 knots with the ability to reach 20. That immediately eliminates most commercial tanker designs. To achieve those speeds, the new oilers will need high-powered propulsion plants comparable to combatants, not auxiliaries. This increases cost, complexity, and construction time. Then comes capacity. A fast oiler must carry enough fuel to make the risk worthwhile. If a ship can keep up with the fleet but only deliver a fraction of what is needed, it solves nothing. Designers target capacities exceeding 100,000 barrels of fuel oil, enough to refuel multiple carriers or dozens of destroyers in a single operation. Defense follows. These ships cannot rely solely on escorts. They will operate close to the fleet, sometimes inside air or submarine threat envelopes. Anti-aircraft guns are added. Compartmentalization is improved. Damage control standards approach those of combat ships. This is a logistical vessel designed to fight for survival, not flee. But the most radical change is procedural. Underway replenishment has existed in limited form for decades, but it has never been standardized at scale. Hoses, rigs, and techniques vary from ship to ship. Crews rely on experience rather than doctrine. For fast fleet oilers to work, replenishment must become predictable, repeatable, and fast. The Navy begins rewriting its manuals. New rigs are developed to allow fuel hoses to be passed quickly between ships moving at speed. Tensioned lines stabilize the connection. Procedures are formalized so that crews who have never worked together can execute replenishment safely in hours rather than days. Training accelerates. Crews practice refueling in increasingly difficult conditions. Night operations become standard. Rough seas are no longer a reason to delay. Mistakes are documented, corrected, and incorporated into revised procedures almost immediately. This is not theoretical work. The war does not pause to allow experimentation. The first of the new fast fleet oilers begin entering service in 1943. They are not perfect. Early replenishment operations are tense and unforgiving. Ships roll, lines snap, equipment fails. But each operation teaches lessons that are fed back into design and doctrine. More importantly, commanders begin planning around these ships as if they will be there. That mental shift is critical. Operations are no longer designed around the question of when the fleet must withdraw to refuel. They are designed around how long the fleet can remain on station if fuel is delivered as planned. The impact is immediate. Carrier task forces begin operating farther from base for longer periods. Refueling rendezvous are scheduled in advance, not improvised. Oilers move with the fleet, not behind it. Fuel becomes something that flows forward, not something that forces retreat. By mid-1943, the change is visible in operational tempo. American forces begin sustaining pressure instead of delivering isolated blows. Raids turn into campaigns. Advances no longer pause simply because fuel is low. The system expands beyond fuel alone. Once oilers prove that replenishment at sea can be routine, the same logic is applied to ammunition, food, spare parts, and aviation supplies. Specialized logistics ships are integrated into task forces. The fleet becomes a self-contained ecosystem. This transformation fundamentally alters the balance of the Pacific War. Japanese naval doctrine, like American doctrine before the war, assumes that major operations are tied to bases. Their logistics system is not designed for sustained underway replenishment at scale. Tankers are fewer, slower, and more vulnerable. Replenishment doctrine remain conservative. As American fleets stay at sea longer, Japanese forces are forced to react. They must either engage at unfavorable times or concede operational space. The initiative begins to shift. The difference becomes stark in late 1943 and early 1944. American carrier task forces conduct continuous operations across vast distances. They strike multiple targets in succession without returning to port. They exploit intelligence rapidly, appearing where Japanese commanders do not expect them. Fuel is no longer the invisible enemy. It is a managed variable. The math that once constrained American operations now works in their favor. Oilers deliver fuel efficiently enough that the cost of keeping the fleet at sea is outweighed by the strategic advantage gained. Each replenishment extends operational reach. Each successful transfer increases confidence. By the time American forces move into the Central Pacific, the logistics revolution is largely complete. Fast fleet oilers are no longer experimental assets. They are essential components of every major operation. Their presence is assumed, planned for, and protected accordingly. Yet this success introduces new risks. As fleets become more dependent on underway replenishment, logistics ships become high-value targets. An enemy that can disrupt fuel delivery can still force withdrawal. Protecting oilers becomes as important as protecting carriers. The system is powerful, but it is not invulnerable. Commanders understand this. Escorts are allocated. Replenishment areas are chosen carefully. Intelligence and air cover are extended to protect the logistics chain. The fleet's striking power now rests on a foundation of moving fuel. By 1944, American naval warfare has been fundamentally redefined. Fleets are no longer tethered to ports. They are sustained by a mobile, industrial-scale logistics system operating in open ocean. This capability does not merely support combat operations, it enables them. The consequences extend beyond the Pacific War. Naval planners recognize that this model will shape future conflicts. Any navy that cannot sustain forces at sea indefinitely will be outmaneuvered by one that can. What began as an attempt to solve a fuel shortage has become a new way of projecting power across oceans. The transformation is quiet, technical, and largely invisible to those watching the war from afar. But its effects are about to become impossible to ignore. By the spring of 1944, the consequences of the transformation are no longer abstract. They are visible on charts, in operational reports, and in the behavior of commanders who now assume that endurance is no longer the limiting factor. American carrier task forces begin operating as if the ocean itself were a base. Operations that would have been unthinkable in 1942 become routine. Task forces steam thousands of miles, strike targets across multiple island groups, refuel at sea, and immediately move on to the next objective. Withdrawal to port is no longer the default response to fuel depletion. It is a deliberate choice, made only when strategically necessary. The pace of the war changes. In the Central Pacific, American forces advance in long, continuous leaps rather than cautious steps. The sequence of operations Gilbert's, Marshall's, Marianas reflects not just tactical success, but logistical confidence. Fleets remain concentrated. Pressure is applied continuously. Japanese forces are denied the time and space needed to recover. The numbers tell the story. A fast carrier task force can now refuel every few days without breaking formation. Destroyers no longer have to peel off early to conserve fuel. Carriers can maintain high-speed maneuvering for extended periods. Air operations expand in both scale and frequency because fuel constraints no longer dictate flight schedules. This changes decision-making at every level. Commanders no longer ask how long they can stay. They ask how much damage they can inflict before moving on. Intelligence gained from reconnaissance can be acted upon immediately rather than deferred. Opportunities are exploited instead of noted and lost. Japanese naval planners recognize what has happened, but they cannot match it. Their logistics system remains tied to bases and limited tanker capacity. Underway replenishment exists, but it is not integrated into fleet doctrine at scale. Japanese tankers are fewer, slower, and increasingly vulnerable to American submarines. As American fleets stay at sea longer, Japanese fuel stocks shrink. The imbalance compounds itself. Every American replenishment operation strengthens the fleet. Every Japanese sortie burns fuel that cannot be easily replaced. By late 1944, fuel shortages begin constraining Japanese operations as severely as they once constrained American ones. Training hours are cut. Fleet movements are restricted. Combat readiness declines. The decisive battles of the later Pacific War reflect this shift. At the Philippine Sea, American carriers operate with confidence, knowing they can sustain prolonged operations. Japanese carriers, short on fuel and trained pilots, are forced into a decisive engagement under unfavorable conditions. The outcome is shaped long before the first aircraft launches. Even at Leyte Gulf, often remembered as a complex series of surface actions, logistics plays a silent role. American fleets can maneuver freely, refuel as needed, and maintain pressure across multiple axes. Japanese forces gamble everything on a single operation because they lack the endurance for anything else. By 1945, the system is mature. Fast fleet oilers operate seamlessly within task forces. Replenishment at sea is conducted day and night in weather that would have halted operations just 2 years earlier. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and aviation supplies flow forward continuously. The fleet functions as a moving industrial machine. This capability enables operations at a scale never before seen. Carrier strikes range across the Western Pacific. Fleets remain on station off Japan itself. The distance from American ports becomes almost irrelevant. The implications extend beyond victory. Naval planners understand that a threshold has been crossed. Power projection is no longer defined by the number of ships a navy possesses, but by how long those ships can remain operational away from home. Logistics is no longer a supporting function. It is a core element of combat power. After the war, this lesson is formalized. The replenishment force becomes a permanent component of fleet organization. Oilers, supply ships, and tenders are designed from the outset to operate alongside combatants. Doctrine assumes sustained operations at sea as the norm, not the exception. Other navies take notice. Those that can afford it adopt similar systems. Those that cannot accept inherent limitations on their reach. The model established in the Pacific becomes the standard against which naval power is measured. The transformation also reshapes strategic thinking. With endurance assured, fleets can deter, patrol, and respond without relying on foreign bases. Naval presence becomes persistent rather than episodic. The political and military implications are profound. What began in 1942 as a quiet crisis fleets, turning back because of fuel, ends as one of the most consequential revolutions in naval warfare. There is no single battle that marks this change. No dramatic announcement, no moment of public recognition. The fast fleet oiler never becomes a symbol of victory. It appears in photographs only at the edges of the frame, hoses stretched between hulls, crews working methodically while carriers loom nearby. Yet without it, the modern concept of naval power does not exist. The United States did not win the Pacific War simply by building more ships or better aircraft. It won by solving the problem of endurance, by ensuring that fleets could remain at sea long enough for superiority to become inevitability. By the end of the war, American naval forces are no longer constrained by distance. They operate where they choose, for as long as they choose, sustained by a logistics system designed to move with them. That change does not fade with peace. It becomes the foundation of post-war naval strategy and remains so to this day. Steel may not fight wars, but fuel, delivered at the right time and place, decides how far war can be taken and who controls the oceans when it does.